Hello everyone. This exhibit of the International Conference on Myth in the World focuses on the group and mythology of tabletop role-playing game players in the 1980s and 1990s. A tabletop role-playing game can be defined as a game where players assume the role of a character and through a combination of dice rolls, rules, imagination, and improvisation overcome challenges set forth by a game master or a predetermined scenario. Plenty of people can't imagine what the stereotypical role-playing game player looked like in the 1980s and 1990s. A group of young, single, nerdy, intelligent, creative, unhygienic, unpopular, nonconformist men huddled around a table in a basement. Outsiders of this group would focus on the perceived negative attributes, such as labeling members of this group as unhygienic, sweaty nerds who are unable to find love and are likely recruiting for the local satanic cult, where they lose their grip on reality and kill themselves in the process. However, people who are a part of the group of tabletop role-playing game players focus on the more positive attributes and define themselves as fans of the fantasy genre, see themselves as creative participants in a shared story which they actively shape, or as intelligent players poring over the rules in an effort to design the most optimal character or scenario to play with their friends, none of which involves any form of being engaged in a satanic cult. When thinking of tabletop role-playing game players in the 1980s and 1990s, a few images come to mind. Some people would likely imagine a group of friends huddled around a table decorated with miniature figurines, dice, and a stack of rulebooks sprawled out over a large hand-drawn game board. Other people might imagine that the group of players was actually a handful of satanic cultists or some other type of troubled individuals. But no matter the image of the imagined players, most of the objects mentioned before are consistent. While these items individually might not conjure an image of tabletop role-playing game players, collectively they do. The first artifact of interest is a miniature figurine, or mini, as they are colloquially called and henceforth referred as. Minis are best described as small tokens to represent a character or object on a game board. Minis are not native to tabletop role-playing games, but with the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, they came to represent the characters of the players and the monsters that they face. While some tabletop role-playing game players might fear ridicule from outsiders, most players feel a sense of accomplishment when it comes to their minis, as they have likely invested time assembling and painting them. The second artifact might be the most prolific and identifiable with tabletop role-playing games, and it is a set of dice. By no means are dice unique to tabletop role-playing games, however, they serve an important role. Dice add an element of randomness, and they usually govern the success rate of a character's actions in the world of tabletop role-playing games. Games like Warhammer and the generic Universal Role-Playing System, or GURPS, use the standard six-sided die most people are familiar with. However, there is a wide variety of tabletop role-playing games that utilize polyhedral dice of varying numbers of sides. Dungeons and Dragons traditionally uses 6 different sided dice, such as a d20, which is a die with 20 sides. Dice such as these are more commonly associated with tabletop role-playing games. Most players develop superstitions about their dice, much like gamblers do, and they like to collect a variety of them. Like any game, there are rules associated with tabletop role-playing games. While most board games will have a small pamphlet containing the rules, tabletop role-playing games will usually have multiple books describing how to play. Most tabletop role-playing games require more than one book. For example, Dungeons and Dragons requires at least 3 books to run the game. Endless amounts of discussions and debates are spawned as players pore over rulebooks to try to understand the rules and the system and how they can bend them in their favor. These sacred texts are actually what make the tabletop role-playing game a game instead of a session of improv acting. They also create a structure for how the game is played, so players can move between different groups with relative ease. One of the artifacts that represent tabletop role-playing game players might not be obvious, but it is important to this group of people. This important artifact is the item with which the players gather around, the table. A table is extremely versatile on its own, and is certainly not unique to tabletop role-playing game players, but ask any player to describe a typical evening engaging in their hobby, and they will usually start their story with the variation of, "We look like any other party of friends gathered around a table." Some tabletop role-playing game players go out of their way to make or buy custom tables just for tabletop role-playing games. The last artifact of interest is more fluid in concept and is portrayed in a variety of ways. It is the game boards upon which the collective imagination of the players is materialized. Different tabletop role-playing games will call for a wide variety of game boards. Games like Warhammer have intricate game boards where players use tape measures to accurately set up the scenario and move their minis, while games like Magic the Gathering have players setting up their cards on a playmat. Games like Dungeons & Dragons can utilize a variety of game boards, such as a battle mat with a grid overlay, a hand-drawn map, or a commercially produced map for players to put their miniatures on. There's plenty of times where Dungeons & Dragons games don't even have established game boards, and the players collectively imagine the scenario while the table will have the other 4 artifacts. The game board would be the collection of notes, papers, notebooks, and other props that make up the game board together. Tabletop role-playing game players in the 1980s and 1990s had a variety of games to choose from that could look vastly different. However, if someone walked into a room and saw miniature figurines, dice, rulebooks, and a type of a game board spread out over a table, they would be able to tell what kind of people were there and would likely have some assumptions about the players. During the 1980s and 1990s, the tabletop roleplay game scene exploded in popularity as the amount of new tabletop role-playing games appeared seemingly out of thin air and the player base grew exponentially. Before people realized it, tabletop role-playing games were everywhere and it was drawing in people like an addiction. The stereotype of the typical tabletop role-playing game player began forming in the public's mind. What kind of person engaged in hours of sitting around a table talking about imaginary people swinging swords and talking about magic? Where did these people come from, and why are they hooked on these games? The elements used to create this group of people have always been a part of human society and were just waiting for the creators to come along and fuse them together. The first element of creation for the group of tabletop role-playing game players is a board game. Board games have been a part of human culture for almost as long as humans have been around. Thousands of years ago, people in Egypt were playing Senet, a board game involving tiles and game pieces. However, board games are not indigenous to Egypt, they are found in every culture and civilization. Board games serve an important function. They provide a way to exercise the mind, to relax, or provide a way for people to spend time together. Since board games are social by design and have a set of rules that players agree to in order to play, board games provide the base framework that allow tabletop role-playing games to be built upon. Another staple of human culture is the creation and distribution of stories, fables, epics, and tales. Human culture is saturated with stories passed down generation to generation, such as oral stories, cave paintings, hieroglyphics, poems, books, music, movies, and video games. The urge to create and to tell stories is ingrained in humanity and is part of what makes humanity unique. This urge is integral to tabletop role-playing games as they can be described as shared storytelling where the players have a shared interest and active involvement in the creation and development of the story. Thus, the storytelling urge is the second element of creation for the group of tabletop role-playing game players. Something that is even more unique to human culture is the concept of creativity and imagination. While creativity and imagination are involved in most creations, in tabletop role-playing games, they are an active force being wielded by the players. Players are encouraged to come up with unorthodox ways to move the story forward and are often rewarded for it. The Game Master uses their power of creativity and imagination to come up with the scenarios and scenes that their players encounter. The other players wield their powers over creativity and imagination in their interactions during the game, but they also use it in creating their characters as well. Tabletop role-playing games create a focus point where people can come together and channel their creativity and imagination together to create a story that is memorable and has meaning to the players. Creativity and imagination are the last creation element used for the group of tabletop role-playing game players. Over the course of their lives, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were struck by creativity itself, and together were able to harness and fuse together the three creation elements to create a tabletop role-playing game known as Dungeons & Dragons, and to define the genre to be known as tabletop role-playing games. Once they presented their gift to humanity, it flourished among the people with great success. The game was so viral that at one point every US submarine was running a game of Dungeons and Dragons. Some people, at seeing the success and attraction of Dungeons and Dragons, sought to tap into their own creative potential to create their own versions, and over time a variety of tabletop role-playing games emerged, such as Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, Warhammer, and Cyberpunk, to name a few of the many that were created during this time. Like with anything, critics were inevitable. After the initial boom of tabletop role-playing games, some people became concerned with the effect it was having on the youth, as mostly college students engaged in tabletop role-playing games at this time. Also during this time, the general public became concerned with brainwashing due to media, and there was a growing concern for the emergence of cults across the United States. Another contributor to the negative perceptions of tabletop role-playing game players was when the disappearance of a college student became sensationalized due to the private investigator incorrectly claiming disappearance was related to Dungeons and Dragons. The private investigator went on to write the book Dungeon Master: The Disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III. This news story, among others, such as Maze and Monsters, a novel, created a fear that Dungeons and Dragons was recruiting people into cults or losing their grip on reality. Other people came to stand against tabletop role-playing game players, such as certain Christian groups believing that Dungeons and Dragons promoted satanic worship. Also, people thought having an interest in fantasy and science fiction was weird. For a long time, the stereotype of a tabletop role-playing game player was that of an unlikable anti-socialist nerd. Tabletop role-playing game players were the other as far as popular culture and the media was concerned for years. No group of mythology is complete without their heroes. For a group of people who create and roleplay as heroes, it might be surprising to learn that the heroes of tabletop role-playing game players are the players themselves. Let's look at David, an outsider to this group. He is on his way home and his mind is racing, thinking about his friends, who have been talking non-stop for weeks about a game called Dungeons and Dragons, and he is mulling over the invitation to join them this weekend. A few weeks later, with the help of his friends, Dave has created his first character and is beginning to explore his first dungeon. After a few months of playing, Dave cannot stop gushing about his adventures with his coworker, who has no clue about what he is talking about. After a lengthy conversation and a spark of interest is shown, Dave invites his coworker to try it out. From curiosity to bringing others into the group, Dave undergoes a hero's journey, and the group of tabletop role-playing game players is rewarded with new members who help ensure the group's survival. When most people think of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and the tabletop role-playing games together, they are likely thinking of how the story told by the game master usually follows the framework of the hero's journey. The hero's journey, or monomyth, is a common storytelling format where a hero is called away to adventure, and along their journey they receive help, face trials, and fight evil. Afterwards, they receive their treasure they were seeking and head home a changed person. However, another perspective is that the tabletop role-playing game players themselves undergo a hero's journey when they join this group, much like Dave's story. To explain the parallel, people will receive their call to adventure when either their friends invite them to play, or perhaps they learn about tabletop role-playing games in another fashion. People leave their ordinary lives to learn about the game. They usually receive help from books, their friends, or the internet along the way to play the game. They'll face trials such as ridicule from others for playing, scheduling conflicts, and confusion about complex rules. The supreme ordeal that they face takes place in the game itself, and they receive rewards in-game and out-of-game. Out-of-game rewards include things like experiencing the story, making friends, and having fun. They then take their experiences back to the normal world, changed by the journey, and tell others. Not only are the players themselves heroes of tabletop role-playing games, but there are also other major heroes who stand out above the rest, casting a much wider net of influence to bring recognition to the group of tabletop role-game players. Major heroes include tournament players who compete for cash prizes and for the recognition of their skill. Another type of major heroes are people who broadcast their game for audiences to listen to and or watch. These major heroes are able to use their influence and popularity to cultivate a fan base and attract a much wider audience than the average player interacts with to bring people into the tabletop role-playing group. The tabletop role-playing group relies on its hero to grow the community and bring new members in. How do they do this? The answer is through word of mouth, one of the most effective marketing campaigns there is. In the 1980s, the public was worried that people who played tabletop role-playing games were engaged in satanic cults, or they were driven insane and would kill themselves. The public was far from the truth, as no evidence of satanic rituals were found. However, tabletop role-playing game players do have a cult of sorts, but it is not satanic in origin like many people thought. Instead, it is led by an infectious spirit that is fueled by creativity and imagination that calls people together to share a story, and this cult of tabletop role-playing games players' only goal is to bring more people into the group to share more stories, and who better to do that than the actual players themselves? So, what does this mean for the community of tabletop role-playing game players moving forward? The community can be assured of their sustainment as new and current players undergo their version of the hero's journey to be part of the community. Tabletop role-playing game players can rely on major heroes to produce enjoyable content and to recruit and market people from a wider audience that may be uninterested or ignorant. As tabletop role-playing game players use word of mouth to keep sharing their stories and adventures, they can utilize the advantages of the internet to extend their reach. Much like any group, as it grows, tabletop role-playing game players will change over time and will create more diverse content for the group. Tabletop role-playing game players should have a lot of hope for the future for their community because there is no end in sight. Thank you for stopping by my exhibit on tabletop role-playing game players from the 1980s and 1990s.